Hi, I am Jerome from Fastlane. Welcome to this series on the Cisco Unified Wireless Networking solution. Today I would like to explain to you how the DHCP Option 43 actually works. You probably heard about this Option 43 by which an access point can find information about a controller. It's often called the vendor-specific option. What does that mean? So as you know, the access points need to find a controller, and to do so it needs to get an IP address. You can configure the IP address statically on the access points, or you can use a DHCP server to provide an IP address to your access point. In this case, the access point is going to get an IP address, and it's also maybe going to get some options. The options can be very classical, such as option number 6, DNS server IP address, or option number 3, router IP address, and so on and so forth. But it can be also a different option, something which is specific to the type of client requesting an IP address. So the option 43 option, vendor specific option, is actually an option that will be sent by the DHCP server that will only be used by a specific client requesting a specific service or a specific information. In our case, what the access point is looking for is a controller IP address. But you understand that only an access point can make use of an IP address which is a controller IP address. So that's why we're returning something which is specific to the vendor, specifically to the Cisco AirNet access point lightweight vending solution. To configure an option 43, actually you should configure two items. The first one is what we call the option 60. The option 60 is the client identifier. What is that? Well, when a DHCP client tries to get an IP address, some clients will not identify themselves. They will just send a broadcast to 255.255.255.255 saying, hey, I need an IP address, someone get me an IP address. Those clients will get an IP address from the DHCP server and the classical options, the common options. Some other clients will identify themselves saying, hey, I am an access point, can I get an IP address? Or hey, I am a scanner, can I get an IP address? And so on. This identification that the client sends is what we call the option 60. So when you configure the option 43, you actually have two possibilities. The first one is to configure the option 43 in the scope option without any specific condition. So what you're doing here is saying whoever asks for an IP address will get the options, among which the option 43, that is to say in my case the controller IP address. You understand that's not the best solution, because any client, any laptop getting an IP address from your DHCP server in that scope will get the option 43, and these clients will not make any use of them, and they will just drop this IP address. So that's why it's often recommended to configure the option 43 in combination with the option 60, so that you say, if you receive this identifier, if this client shows up asking for an IP address, send back an IP address and also send this option. But if any other client, not identifying itself as being such, access point in my case, shows up, well, you'll give an IP address and you'll give some options, but you will not give this vendor specific option. Okay, so how do you configure this option 43 and this option 60? Well, depends on what kind of platform you're on. In this example here, I have two platforms for you. The first one is the classical Microsoft DHCP server. It's probably the platform on which it's the most complicated task to configure because you need 3 steps, whereas on the iOS, which we'll do next, you just need to add 1 or 2 lines to your scope to make this work. So let's look at the Windows option. So here, as you can see, I have one DHCP server in which I have 2 scopes. In my scope 10.1.3.0, which is subnet 3 AP, so as you can guess it's for the access points, I already have some options. Option 3 router, option 6 DNS server, option 15 domain name. So that means that any client requesting an IP address from this DHCP server in scope 10.1.3.0 will get an IP address, but also the options 10.1.3.1 is your router, your default gateway, 10.10.50.100 is your DNS server, and the domain name you're working in is fastlane.com. So that's the common options. What you want to do here is to define another option, a new option. but it has to be done again in 3 steps. The first step is to say, I want to define this identifier, this option 60. That is to say, which client is going to identify itself as such, to which I will be providing this IP address. So to do that, you right-click on the DHCP server itself, and you go to Define Vendor Classes. So vendor classes are client classes. You're saying that's how clients of this vendor will identify themselves. So here you already have a few Microsoft options, and what you want to do here is to create a new option for your access point. So the name is, of course, whatever you like. Here I'm going to say that's the AP identifier. That's how the IP is going to identify itself. Description, well, name sent by the IP as an ID. And then you have to configure that field, this string. The way it's written, the way access points send their name, unless you use the old airspace access points, which have a different way of sending their name, but if you use a Cisco access point, the way the name is sent is always Cisco with a cap C and the rest in lowercase, then space, then AP in capital, so cap C, Cisco, space AP cap, then lower c, and the model number. So for example, if you use a 1252 access point, it's going to be a 1250 series, so you'll say C, lowercase c, 1250. If you use a 1131 access point, it's going to be the 1130 series, so you'll say C1130. If you use a 1242, you're going to say C1240, and so on and so forth. So that's the string that is expected from my access point when it's going to request an IP address. It's going to identify itself saying, hey, I'm Cisco APC 1250, can I get an IP address please? Alright, so I can identify my access points here. Next step, of course, is to say, what do I do once I get this identifier? Well, what I do is that I send back the controller management IP address. So the next step is to define that what you want to send back is the controller management IP address. So here again, you right click on the DHCP server and you go to predefined options. Set predefined options here. You already have, of course, a few classes, and among the classes, if everything goes well, you should have the AP identifier that we just created. So you say for the option class AP identifier, that is to say for all clients saying, hey, I am at access point 1250, you want to send back what? Well, you have to add the option. You have to add what you want to send back. And of course, what you send back is the controller management IP address. Data type, guess what? It's necessarily an IP address. And if you want to send back several IP addresses, if you want to send an IP address for 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 controllers, you can click Array, which will give you the possibility to send back several IP addresses instead of just one. Then you have this code field here. What is that? Well, think about it. You're going to send to the access point an IP address. But somehow you have to tell the access point, hey, the IP address I'm sending back to you here, although it's called option 43, you know, option 43 is vendor specific. But specific, precisely what is it? Is it the management IP address? Is it the virtual IP address? Is it the AP manager IP address? You know, what kind of IP address are you sending back here? So within the option 43, which is just a generic container for anything which is vendor specific, you have to tell your access point, what I'm sending back to you here is the controller management IP address. So this has a specific code that the access point identifies as being the controller management IP address. And the code for the controller management IP address is 241. Why? I don't know. And how do you remember that? Well, you just learn it by heart. You have to remember that the option you send here is 241, meaning controller management IP address. Okay, you can set a description here if you want to, or ignore it.